So we're going to turn over to our first panel of the day, looking at the institutional challenges to democracy in the Americas. It's a fantastic panel, which I'm sure is going to be a fantastic discussion, and is moderated by a very near and dear friend, Dr. Orlando Perez. I will keep the Honduras stories to ourselves, like Vegas rules. But Dr. Perez is the Dean of School of Liberal Arts and Sciences at the University of North Texas at Dallas, one of the premier experts on civil-military relations in the Western Hemisphere, as well as one of the key leaders in the Vanderbilt Latin America Public Opinion Project, looking at citizen opinion across the hemisphere. So with that, Dr. Perez, I turn it to you.
Thank you, Randy. Thank you very much for that generous introduction. And yes, what happens in Honduras stays in Honduras, I guess. I want to thank you, and I want to thank the Gordon Institute and the Kimberly Green Latin American Caribbean Center and the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs at FIU for the invitation to moderate this session. And for organizing a really terrific conference. I've been able to log in for a lot of it, and it's been a really great event. I want to also thank Scott Tollefson of the Perez Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies for introducing and for supporting our edited volume. That was very nice, Scott, and I absolutely appreciate it. And I'm sure that Gabriel and Brian and all of our contributors appreciate the support of you and of the Perez Center for the book. I want to start out by thanking the co-editors of this volume on democracy and security in Latin America, state capacity and governance under stress, which kind of serves as the backdrop for these two sessions this morning, as Scott mentioned. Gabriel, Marcella, and Brian Fonseca, and particularly Gabriel for really being the driving force behind this volume. However, all edited books are only as good as the contributors and the contributing authors. And we believe that we have gathered some of the best scholars and practitioners in the field. And so I really recommend the book. If you don't care for any of the editors, that's fine. Purchase it and read it for the contributions, which are fantastic. I've been told that Tatiana is not with us this morning, at least not yet. So I'm going to introduce the two panelists that are here, and then I'm gonna say a few introductory remarks and ask a general question and turn it over first to Gabriel and then to Jonathan for their initial comments of 5 to 7 minutes. Although if Tatiana doesn't show, then we have a little bit of flexibility on the time, but I do want to leave plenty of time for Q&A and interaction with the audience, which I know is quite extensive. Gabriel Marcella is a distinguished fellow and former director of the Americas Studies at the U.S. Army War College. He served as international affairs advisor to the commander-in-chief at the U.S. Southern Command, and has been a consultant to the Departments of State and Defense on Latin American security. He has written extensively on Latin American security and U.S. policy, teaching strategy, and the Washington interagency process. Jonathan Rosen is assistant professor in the Professional Security Studies Department at New Jersey City University. Dr. Rosen earned his master's in political science from Columbia University and his PhD in international studies from the University of Miami. Jonathan's research focuses on drug trafficking, organized crime, and security. He has published over 20 books with a number of prominent presses, including Routledge, Palgrave Macmillan, the University of Florida, and others. He has published journal articles in Trends in Organized Crime, the Journal of Criminal Justice, Deviant Behavior, International Journal of Offender Therapy and Comparative Criminology, among many others. And he has participated in grant-funded research studies in El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, Colombia, and Mexico. And if I know Jonathan, he is probably juggling at least 2 or 3 books at this very moment, which will come out within the next few months. And he recently published a novel, so he is now a novelist. So great work, Jonathan. Is Tatiana here? No, not yet. Okay. I will introduce her. Well, I'll introduce her now, and if she shows up, we can proceed. Tatiana Costadinova is professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations at Florida International University. She received her PhD from Florida State University. Her research and teaching interests include political institutions with a special emphasis on electoral systems and reform, East European democratic transition, and comparative public policy. And she has been a recipient of several grants, among which the American Political Science Mole Research Grant and a fellowship program award from the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Professor Kostadinova's first book, Bulgaria, 1879 to 1946, The Challenge of Choice, explores Bulgarian parliamentary elections, party strategies, and voter behavior. Her next book, Political Corruption in Eastern Europe, Politics After Communism, analyzes the emergence of corruption as a major obstacle to successful democratic transitions. She has published extensively on a number of peer-reviewed prominent journals, such as Journal of Peace Research, European Journal of Political Research, and the American Journal of Political Science, among many others. So let me just make a couple of remarks about the basic topic of our discussion this morning. We know from the discussions throughout this week and from our knowledge of the region that democracy is under stress across the world. We see it in our on our nightly news or in on Twitter or in social media. We see it every day. And of course, that stress includes the Western Hemisphere. The rise of populism and authoritarianism continues to challenge democratic governance in the region. One of the key deficiencies stems from weak states, lacking the capabilities to respond to domestic or external challenges, including economic dislocation, pandemics, and other natural disasters, corruption, illicit networks, weak judicial systems, dysfunctional executive-legislative relations, and hyper-presidentialism, which concentrates power in the hands of the executive, among many others. In an article in 2020, Francis Fukuyama said that, quote, "It takes a state," close quote, "to deal with a crisis." And certainly the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed the vulnerabilities of the Latin American states and added an immense burden to already weak and stretched administrative capabilities. Global pandemic also called into question the traditional notion that national security depends upon economic and military power. That concept is yielding to the reality that human security is the strategic imperative because borders provide little defense against the catastrophic spread of viruses or the challenges of transnational criminal networks or migration and displacement of populations or climate change or cybersecurity threats or the spread of fake news and the toxic nature of social media or populism and authoritarianism. Ultimately, state capacity is multidimensional, with all elements interacting to produce governance. Similarly, democracy and state capacity are intimately related. The former is not possible without the coercive, extractive, and administrative capacity of the state. Moreover, both must have legitimacy to be effective and sustained for the long term. And this really is the basic premise, the basic thesis of our edited volume. And so given that democracy and state capacity are intimately related, and the former is not possible without the capacity of the state, I would ask Gabe and Jonathan, from their perspectives and from their research, can you describe the key institutional deficiencies, again, from your perspective, confronting Latin American states, particularly in a post-pandemic world? And before I turn it over to first Gabe and then Jonathan, just to reiterate, there is translation, simultaneous translation. If you go down to where it says interpretation, you will get English, Spanish, and Portuguese. And then if you have questions, please place them in the Q&A box. Gabe, from your perspective, what are the key institutional deficiencies confronting Latin American states, particularly in the post-pandemic world?
Thank you, Orlando. Good morning to all of you. It's an honor and a pleasure to be with such a distinguished group of scholars and practitioners. The conference that I followed the past few days has already identified what I would call the strategic context for my part of the of today's panel. So I won't go over what describes the so-called strategic context, but I want to deal with the challenges and the defects and the problems of state capacity and weak state capacity at the level of the military and the armed forces, specifically the Ministry of Defense and the armed forces. So I'm going to make approximately 6 comments and a wrap-up comment about the need for a new coalition between military and civilian capacity in the region. So what is the role of military power in providing sufficient security for democratic governance? This is the key question. It's fundamental. We just heard it in the previous hour from the keynote speaker for today about stability, operations, and governance. Policy is a statement of goals, where strategy is the employment of military power to achieve the political goals of the state. Let's remember this point. Often, civil-military relations in Latin America is looked at in terms of who has power, civilians or military, and seldom and not sufficiently enough do we focus on the responsibility of the state to provide security through the use of military power in a legitimate and effective way. So this is the most fundamental defect that I see throughout the hemisphere. And it's an enormous challenge. And I'll try to describe some of the problems that are associated with it. So managing civil-military relations to provide effective security is the biggest challenge of all. Now, we can look at Colombia as a case study of how they did it right, and it's still ongoing. It's an unfinished process. There are successes and there are failures in the Colombian case. So the story is not finished. But I think the academic community, as well as the policy community, should continue to follow and mine the lessons learned in the Colombian experience. The question of how policy is converted into military power and then military power achieves political goals, that is a function of the Ministry of Defense, my second point. The ministries of defense in Latin America are weak. They do not function as ministries of defense in the classic sense. It's there, theoretically, the MOD mobilizes resources and programs and people to achieve policy goals. In Latin America, more often than not, this does not happen very well. Often the leadership is military, and in those cases where there are civilians, it's often retired military. And in many cases, civilian MODs do not have enough expertise. But it's the power equation that counts. Who has the power to function, to provide those functions? It's often the leader of the army or the armed forces in general, and not so much the Ministry of Defense. There is an emerging capacity among civilians with respect to military affairs, and this has to be taken, it has to be grown, developed, and properly rewarded by having opportunities to work in meaningful positions in ministries of defense and associated agencies. The next point is the question of size and budgets and readiness. Latin American armed forces are among the smallest in the world. They range from Brazil's 335,000 to perhaps 15,000 for Honduras, and even smaller for the island countries of the Caribbean. Budgets are equally small, but budget shortages can be lethal because you need to maintain equipment, you need to pay personnel, you need to train people adequately, and accidents do happen, bad accidents, disastrous accidents. The Argentine submarine that sank, most of the reason for the tragedy was it didn't have enough training time underwater, the crew and the submarine itself. Brazil in 2019 reduced its defense budget, and the personnel costs rose to 81%, leaving 19% for equipment, for training, and for modernization. Colombia, again, has been an exception because of the internal conflict that it has had. Even there, in order to get sufficient revenues, the Uribe administration imposed a war tax, which over time helped build a significant military and police force to deal with the problems of internal conflict. One of the outcomes of small military budgets and small military institutions is that it provides less linkages to civilian society. The smaller they are, the more difficult they are to integrate into society and the problem of isolation can be a difficult one to deal with. Moreover, legislatures tend to be less engaged if the budgets are low. It's interesting to observe how active the Colombian Congress has been in dealing with the problems of the conflict.
Gabe, you might want to start wrapping up.
Oh, sure, I will. Crime. Much of the discussion so far in this conference has dealt with crime. Should the military deal with crime? In a support role. It cannot be dependent upon to be the exclusive institution to deal with crime. The sixth point is war and state building. To what degree has the modern period of warfare in a country such as Colombia helped create state capacity using Charles Tilley's formulation and Miguel Ángel Centeno's formulation of the effect of war on societies and state capacity? This is something that the scholars have not touched yet sufficiently. Jennifer Holmes and her colleague have done some work on this, and you can see it in the book. Finally, Orlando, we need, and this is the work that Scott Tollefson does so well at the center, we need a new civil military coalition to deal with the problems in the 21st century. With that, I will leave it to the general discussion. Thank you.
Jonathan.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for the very kind invitation. It's a real honor to be here. So I think that it's a tough question. There's a lot of issues to deal with, but what I really see when you look at the polling data is you see consistencies of people don't trust anyone, right? Whether it's politicians, they feel unsafe, even in countries like Bolivia and Peru, where the level of insecurity is much lower than Mexico or let's say El Salvador. There's this perception of general insecurity in Orlando and the team who's worked a lot with LAPOP, and you look at the polling over time, it's almost consistently unstable, right? Or stably unstable in some ways. I think there's a trend when you're looking institutions, and there's debates among scholars like Desmond Arias who say, well, in reality, institutions are doing exactly what they're meant to do, right? We have all these names, we have institutions, but kind of violence is built into some of the institutions. So there's an intense debate, particularly among political scientists. One of the things what I would say is when you're looking at this general distrust among the police, among politicians, among the judiciary, reforming this requires a whole of government approach, right? You've seen the alphabet reforms in Mexico, for example. I think the Felipe Calderón administration reformed the police 5 times, right? You've seen the alphabet soup of name changes. I've given lectures to Mexican federal police and I forgot who I'm talking to, right? Because then, the López Obrador administrations rolled everything up into the National Gendarmerie. We've seen, the National Guard. We've seen a lot of reforms to police across the region. And I think that it requires deep structural reforms, not just name changes, not just redesigning, administrative functions. So it does nothing to reform the police if you don't reform the prison system, right? Prisons in Latin America, and I wrote my chapter on prisons, are, frankly, some of them are schools of crime, right? The leaders of gangs, the leader of criminal organizations do, if you look at places like Brazil, if you look at Colombia, you look at Central America, really organized behind the prison systems, control operations behind bars. And we've seen escapes from people like Chapo Guzman. And we've seen this question of, so reforming institutions does require a whole of government approach. It can't just be the police. It also has to think a lot, and I think scholars, frankly, have understudied this. David Shirk wrote a lot about the kind of the impunity levels in Mexico. If someone does end up going to jail, right, where do they go to? Where do they go to in a prison system? The government, not me, in Mexico, had a study a couple of years ago saying that 60% of prisons in Mexico are controlled by organized crime, right? If you go to El Salvador, you go to Honduras, where you've seen allegations of, people who are going to testify against Tony Hernandez or Juan Hernandez, who's been extradited to the United States, allegations of people being murdered, right, by their own the attorneys making these allegations. Obviously, everyone's innocent until proven guilty in the court of law, but basically prisons have become epicenters of conflict and crime, right, across the region. The judiciary, right? I think one of the arguments that I would make, and it's occasionally you have to make some lawyer jokes, right? But my colleagues who are lawyers say, well, we just need new laws. No, frankly, I respectfully disagree. Latin America has many, many laws, right? Many countries in Latin America. You used to joke, I lived in Mexico as a professor in Mexico, that Mexico has a beautiful constitution. And some of my scholars would say, we just need this new reform. I frankly think some of the reforms have been smoke and mirrors. It's not needing a new law, it's applying the law. Right. And I think you see that consistently in countries around the region. And this leads to another element of the high rates of impunity. Right. So despite many reforms, many attempts at structural reforms, impunity in some countries around the region remains, I've seen as high as 99% in estimates, for example, in places like Mexico, but well above 90%. Right. And so I think dealing with this kind of state fragility, state weakness, strengthening the state apparatus requires looking at these different institutions. One of the things that I see that is quite challenging, frankly, and it's a difficult issue to talk about, is a symbiotic relationship in some countries between the state and organized crime, right? We could look at the case of Honduras, which is we talked about a great deal. You look at the case of Mexico. Cienfuegos, right? General Cienfuegos was going to be extradited, was arrested in Los Angeles. The foreign minister basically said, quoting him, that it would be suicide if the Mexicans did not prosecute him. And in Mexico, he remains free. So this individual who's, again, allegations of connections to the H3 cartel, kind of a organizations that's emerged out of fragmentation for money laundering, trafficking arms, et cetera, has gone free in Mexico, right? And basically the equivalent of the foreign minister said, well, it would be a crime if we did not prosecute him. We see Garcia Luna, who was arrested in Miami, facing life in prison in Mexico. And we've seen a lot of high-level functionaries at top levels, being connected to organized crime. So the final comments in the final minute or two that I have, just initial remarks, is we've seen this kind of symbiotic relationship in certain countries between organized crime, very powerful transnational organized crime groups, and high-level government officials, right? And so I think we've seen this as something not new. Mexico has 71 years of the PRI rule, the Institutional Revolutionary Party. It is not that the PRI did not have organized crime, they cut deals with them. So I think one of the trends that you're seeing is, how do we deal with this kind of collusion and an issue of corruption? It's combating these networks and combating the penetration of organized crime in the state apparatus, right? In certain zones in Latin America, and I think this is particularly true in a lot of work that FIU's done in Central America, you see gangs and criminal organizations operate as de facto authorities in certain zones, particularly in the Northern Triangle, right? And so I think governments have kind of have gone from a number of policies of let's negotiate, whether it's under the table and allegations of the Bukele administration, what we've seen in the past year, that they've been cutting deals with MS-13. Let's, cut deals at different levels. And we've seen in certain zones where this kind of then what I call the show and tell strategy of let's go after certain criminal groups, but not others, right? And I think we've seen sort of politicians running. I mean, Juan Hernandez ran on a campaign of, the party's over for the criminals. Let's go after gangs and certain criminal organizations, but cut deals with others, right? So I think understanding these kind of trends of, how do we disentangle the grip on organized crime? Again, I don't want to paint a blanket statement. The region is very diverse. Countries are very different. But I think that presents a real challenge is when you're looking, in conclusion, when you're looking at reforming institutions across countries, when you're looking at a whole of government approach, when you're looking at dealing with reform in the police, the judiciary, the prison system, disentangling the web of organized crime has proven quite challenging as they've diversified and become more powerful over time. So those are my initial comments. And again, a very complicated, intricate question, but I do see this symbiotic relationship as presenting a great deal of challenges in certain countries.
Thank you, Jonathan. And Tatiana Costadinova has joined us. So thank you, Tatiana. I did introduce you and read your bio. So I'm going to turn it over to you. The question that I asked to initiate the discussion was about what institutional deficiencies are confronting from the perspective of the presenter are confronting states, particularly in the post-pandemic. And I know that your area of study is Eastern Europe, and from a comparative perspective, perhaps you can elucidate how you see Latin America and generally the deficiencies of the states in establishing security and democracy as two interconnected concepts. And about 7 minutes and initial and statement.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and sorry for the late connection. I was misled. I thought we were starting at 11:15. Doesn't matter. I'm here, and I'm very happy to be with you today and to share some of my thoughts about institutions, institutional development deficiencies, and the future of democratization. And I have been doing this from the perspective of the experience of the Central and Eastern European transitional states. But thematically, my research has been very much concentrated on elections, the electoral process, institutional development and reform, corruption, and recently populism. I wanted to start with some observations that I have been able to make that led me to provoke my interest into the Latin American cases. This is my interest came from the fact that it's not only institutional development and institutional reform that we are interested in, but it's also how people feel about how the citizens of the countries feel, because it touches upon the issue of legitimacy and of the political system, and of the way people relate to institutions, and also to the outcomes of the political system, to things such as the electoral process as a mechanism of elite recruitment, to integrity in the public sector, and to democratic backsliding and the future of populism. And I think that all these are closely related to the democratization process in Latin America as well. So I have been exploring recently data coming from the latest wave of the world value system, trying to explore whether there are some patterns with regard to how the citizens from 8 Latin American countries relate to the institutions, mostly how much they trust them. And I have been able to distinguish between more political institutions, but also less so institutions such as the military, the armed forces that are given the past of Latin America, past experience with the military being involved in the government. I think that it is extremely important, but also trust in, for example, the judicial system. Trust in the courts and the judicial system is instrumental, because it's the judicial system that has to take care of things such as punishing corruption, bringing more trust in the government, and heightening the levels of political efficacy and how active people are in the political process. And I would be more than happy to share with you. I've prepared some graphs that show maybe some patterns that are emerging with regards to these 8 Latin American countries, and I'll be talking about them because there is considerable variation in the way that I have noticed in the way Latin American citizens trust, for example, the military. For example, confidence in the military in Brazil is more than 60%. It's a very high percent. In other places, it's lower, but still it's the most trusted institution over there compared to the government or to the parliament or political parties. But anyways, I will be more than happy in the course of this panel to share some of these results with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tatiana, for those remarks. And Jonathan brought up an interesting point about the state captured by criminal networks and the issues of what happens when the state is in fact part of the illicit networks or captured by those illicit networks, right? And we have examples across the world and in Latin America. Venezuela comes to mind, of course, and John Polga Hesimovich in the next panel is going to talk about Venezuela. We don't want to preempt his talk, but just generally, perhaps expand on, and I'll start with Jonathan and then go to Tatiana and Gabriel. If you could expand on, we talk about the need for state capacity, right? And the need for a strong state, but what happens when the state is the problem? When state capacity is being used at the service of illicit networks? How do we deal with that?
Yeah, I think it's something that's been very troubling. And I think Tatiana pointed out a very good point. When I made my initial comments about institutions being not trusted, as we've all said, the panel, and it's very important that the military is one of the most trusted institutions. But I think a lot of the relationship between the state and organized crime just leads to high levels of distrust. I mean, it blows my mind in El Salvador, in a country that had 12 years of civil war, 75,000 people killed, that the most recent LAPOP data shows that more than 50% of the country would support a military coup to reduce crime, right? So I think you see this intense level of desperation of people, right? And the numbers are relatively similar if you look at some other countries. I think that it requires top-down change, but it's very, very difficult. I mean, if you look at the case of Honduras and Tigre Bonilla, who's being extradited, right, to the United States, was a general and the chief of police, and is, allegedly, right, involved in drug trafficking, money laundering, arms trafficking, and we could go case after case after case. I mean, I tend to focus on Mexico, Colombia, and some Central American countries. So I think trying to understand how to disentangle this requires going back to prosecuting people, right? Requires going back to not just show and tell strategies. I think we tend to see cases of let's arrest certain individuals, lower level individuals, let's kind of, and I think you've seen this a lot in Mexico and now particularly in El Salvador with criminal groups of let's market it via Twitter, let's have this kind of marketing to the public of we're going after this corrupt official or this gang member arresting this criminal organized leader. But it's kind of, in certain institutions, and I don't want to sound too drastic, I think need just to fundamentally start over, right? Or to fundamentally reform, right? We've seen, I mean, I lived in Mexico, and in the state that I lived in, the entire police force was allegedly involved in a murder, and the military came down to disarm them, right? We've seen the entire police force fired in states like Guerrero and Acapulco, in the city of Acapulco. So I think trying to disentangle this relationship requires time. It's not something that's going to happen overnight, but I think it's fundamentally implementing the rule of law. I just read the indictment of Juan Hernandez, and some of this stuff, you couldn't make up in a novel, right? I mean, the level of intricacies, again, all allegations still proven in the court of law, right? Of connections between Chapo Guzman sending $1 million in bribes. It was alleged during the court trials of Chapo Guzman that he paid Enrique Peña Nieto $100 million in bribes. So disentangling this web also requires a levels of analysis problem, right? At what level are we talking about? I tend to see, particularly in my research on Mexico, that there's more corruption, particularly at the lower levels. I mean, the lower levels of the Mexican police are some of the most corrupt because there's just less transparency. It's a dangerous job. It's easier to turn your head. There's much less trust in the local police than there were, for example, in the federal police. So disentangling this web, I think fundamentally kind of going back to the basics of prosecuting people who are corrupt, prosecuting them, making sure they end up in prison. And I think we've seen in certain leaders, I mean, the case of, and I'll end on this, you know, Tony Saca stole $300 million from the El Salvadoran state. Mauricio Funes fled and became a Nicaraguan citizen and proudly voted in a sham election, right, in Nicaragua, stole $350 million, right? Francisco Flores died while awaiting trial. And so we've seen these high level problems, but I think fundamentally sending to a message to people of people who break the law will be prosecuted and will end up in prison. I think we see, and there's been a lot of research that this tends not to be the case, and impunity and this kind of vicious cycle. I do think there are cases of success. I don't want to paint this kind of drastic picture of everything's, you know, black and white and there's no gray, but it is complicated. I think it's complicated and it takes time. So yeah, I'm not sure I gave a great answer, but it's fundamentally going back to the basics.
No, fantastic answer. And imagine how many millions we're going to find out that the current president, if he ever leaves office, has stolen. So just a little off-color humor about El Salvador. But you're absolutely right that you know, you have LAPOP data shows significant decline in satisfaction with democracy in general, and particularly in El Salvador, which you mentioned, significant and troubling increase in support for the current administration, which by all measures, by all objective measures, is moving in a very authoritarian and populist manner, and endangering democracy in that country. Tatiana, and then Gabriel on the issue of the state and its connections with criminal networks.
This is would be a very long conversation. It's a big topic, very big, but I will touch upon some things that were already said and a few other thoughts. First of all, the material, what do we understand on the government capacity so that the state is effective in achieving its goals? There are different aspects of capacity. It could be material capacity, it could be financial, it could be technological capacity, it could be personnel, the well-trained people to deal with these big challenges. So there are different things. That's why it has been so difficult to address and to improve state capacity. So how do we improve it? From my own research, I have seen that material capacity means if there is no material capacity, if the state and the people who are governing the country at the moment do have the will and the desire, they might still not be able to do much because they lack material capacity. So what does it mean? Does it mean to increase the salaries of these officials so that they do not rely on other side payments and so on and so forth? And here is the question with this is especially relevant at the lower levels where we see petty corruption going on, and this was mentioned already, because individual citizens interact mostly with those lower level officials, with the local, the mayor, with the local government, with the police. But once you ask the citizens whether they agree to the bureaucrats to receive higher salaries, then we get a different picture. People say, no, they are paid enough, let them do their job. So this is very difficult to achieve, and there is a political cost to pay if you go that way. But for sure, material capacity should be improved in order to achieve something. Another question is this connection with organized crime and the level of crime that we see, and all these killings, people being assassinated assassinated in Latin America. This is a very serious problem there. So one thing that can be done, can be tracked down, is to see whether politicians do receive money from these gangs or from leaders of the organized crime, so that there should be some sort of institutional arrangement about the funding of political parties and political candidates for office that restricts such payments to be made, including having serious sanctions against if such cases are found. The role of the judiciary, yes, the judiciary, the court system plays a big role here, whether they can deal with and punish those who are guilty. And still here, there is something we have to pay attention to. Research on Italy, for example, has shown that after 1992, with their big campaign for cleaning politics, what happened is also researchers started to notice that there are some instances of politicizing of the judiciary. When certain judges make their decisions on the basis of their political motivations, or there is clearly a desire by politicians to use the court system in order to and influence the court system in order to get a revenge against political rivals or to weaken political rivals. And one last thing that I wanted to mention is that what we also see, and I saw it from the data coming from Latin America, is that there is a strong association between the levels of corruption and lack of integrity, perceived corruption, lack of integrity in public life, and the preference for a strong leader. So is this a solution? Maybe in the eyes of some citizens, it would be a solution. Well, all these political parties are corrupt, all these bureaucrats are corrupt, let's have a strong leader who will set things in order. And in these levels in Latin America overall are much higher than the levels I know from Central and Eastern Europe. And just to give you an example, I was surprised, stunned, to see that in Ecuador, it's about close to 3/4, close to 75% of the population of those respondents in the survey who said they preferred, it's a very good idea to have a strong leader, and this is associated with perceived corruption. So there is no an easy answer.
Oh, thank you.
So none of these questions have easy answers. Gabriel.
Right, thank you very much. Obviously, this needs an entire conference, this very question. The rule of law is the answer. There's no alternative. We have to fight for the rule of law. We have to train people. We have to educate our judicial system. We have to form it up. We have to defend it, and you need security. Without security, nothing else is possible. Unfortunately, democratic security of the kind that we want is not possible in these circumstances described by Jonathan and Tatiana. I've been watching Ecuador slowly go down the drain, literally. It is a very, very sad case. A student of mine, former student, was the defense minister. He resigned because the defense ministry building was penetrated by a pyramid schemer, big money. The defense ministry. This is unbelievable. The level of corruption and incompetence that goes along with corruption, intended or not intended. But so I'm afraid that the future is El Salvador or Orlando. The future is a long period of compromising the institutions of the state for private purpose. And I am very, very pessimistic.
Gabriel, going back to your initial remarks about the military and military roles, we have seen, and you mentioned it in your remarks, and you mentioned it in your chapter in the book, what could best be described as mission creep among the militaries in the region, an expanding array of roles as a function of, I think, in many cases, the lack of state capacity to deal with natural disasters or to deal with other domestic policing, international crime, drug trafficking, or protection of the environment, et cetera, right? And even delivery of healthcare. And we saw this expansion increase significantly in the last couple of years because of the pandemic. So I guess my question to you, because you talked about the need for civilian expertise, and I wonder if you think that this two parts, that this mission creep and this increase in roles, first, how does it affect nationalism and institutionalization of the armed forces? And second, does it reduce the promotion of civilian expertise? Does it affect negatively the needed development of civilian expertise?
Troubling and excellent question. The military is thrown into the breach to do things that it's really not organized to do. I'm thinking of the deployments in the favelas in Rio and the problem with the prisons in Ecuador. The short answer is the military is the only institution which obeys orders and does things. It can get things done. It has administrative capacity, logistical capacity, communication, intelligence, transportation, etc. These are fungible. In the absence of sufficient civilian capacity, the military is thrown into the breach to do those things that you described. Although some of the things that you said are rather traditional, such as humanitarian assistance for disasters, fighting fires, for example. But there is a cost in the long term that if you rely too much on the military to do the job, then that takes responsibilities away from the police and other agencies of the state. I think governments, therefore, are required to make that trade-off, hoping that they can recoup in the future. But if you look at state capacity throughout Latin America, it's so variable. It's so weak in some cases and non-existent in some cases. Venezuela, Haiti, Ecuador, very difficult, very difficult. So yes, the answer is more civilian capacity and less military involvement in civilian activities. But how to get there from here, that's the essential question. Thank you.
Let me follow up just briefly, and if you could give a brief response, and then I'll turn to Tatiana and Jonathan if they want to say something about that issue. What from your perspective, what should the U.S. do to promote increased civilian capacity in defense and security issues?
Right. A lot is being done through the Center for Hemispheric Defense Affairs. American graduate programs in defense and security have Latin American students. Colombia sent, the country of Colombia, the government sent students to Columbia University, the Institute of War, to study there in preparation for returning to positions within the government. So you have to invest and take the risk for the long term benefit of the polity at hand in civilian expertise. And then you have to have defined professional employment opportunities in the government, in the ministries. Brazil is probably further ahead than any other country in this respect. But as an Argentine officer once said, no hay mercado, there's no market for civilian professionals in defense jobs. It's a very weak market. It's not prestigious. Again, Brazil is a sole exception. Increasingly, Chile, Colombia, you have graduate programs for civilians and military in national security, cyber defense, and other activities. What should the United States do? The United States should promote as much as possible, not just civil-military dialogue on democracy, but building civilian capacity to deal with all of the problems that have been described in this conference. Latin America really needs human capital to deal with the panoply of problems described by the conference. Thank you very much for the question.
Jonathan, Tatiana, do you have anything to add to that question?
I would just say from a crime perspective, I think the military is going to continue to be relied upon. I think we've seen it in many countries, and I think in some ways overstretched, right? And I think it tends to be kind of a hammer and a nail situation of, well, we have internal problems. We have more internal problems, let's say, external threats. Salvador's not worried that Guatemala is going to invade it tomorrow. Mexico's not worried that Guatemala is going to invade it tomorrow. How do we combat, if we're in Mexico, for example, drug trafficking and organized crime? And so I do think it does go back to, and people like Mark Unger and Orlando, and you've written this a lot, on police reform, right? And how to reform the police, which is a very difficult task. I think fundamentally it's not only training, but salaries, right? I mean, the U.S. government does a lot of training. There's a lot of excellent work being done, but keeping people, addressing the high turnover. I think one of them is simple solution, but it's more difficult to implement is paying people and getting them to stay in the job, because you see such high turnover, right? Because it is a dangerous job, because it is stressful, because there are a lot of challenges. So I think we're going to continue to see the military utilized. I mean, Lopez Obrador, on this, campaigned on the war on drugs being a failure, on not using the military. And the first thing he did was roll up the National Guard, which is 70% military, and deploy them on the streets. And his entire campaign was, it's hugs and not bullets, and it's, combating corruption. And the first thing he did was rely on the military, which he doesn't have a great relationship with. But so I think I agree with Gabriel's assessment.
Anna?
My first reaction to this is, well, there are sometimes situations in which the military, as the most effective, apparently, institution should be used. There was the pandemic, and there are other situations. Now we worry that with the war in Ukraine, there could be a world crisis of food and grain, the grain supply. So this can provoke internal instability and violence in countries. They're talking about Africa now, but we don't know how far this can go. So in such situations, apparently the military can come handy to be used in order to establish order, if the capacity of the state and the other state institutions is not sufficient. But what I just wanted to emphasize here, maybe it's the first thing to do is to have a clear definition of the roles that the army plays and the police plays and the rest of the government institutions play. If these are very clearly defined, then this should be one good start to have, but sometimes we have very vague, ambiguous definitions of the roles, so that in a country that is presidential or a system or there is concentration of power at the center, it's so many things can be used to justify the sudden use of the military. Let's bring the army. So this I think is important.
Oftentimes it is done on an emergency basis, but it never ends. You know, the emergency decree keeps getting reissued, or the emergency transforms into a permanent use. So it is a concern. Let me ask, Jonathan, your chapter in the book was about prisons and prison reform or the lack thereof. And of course, prisons are very important for state capacity and for many of the issues that we're talking about, particularly dealing with, obviously, violence and crime. But as you said, prisons are oftentimes schools for criminals, right? The recidivism rate is huge. And not only that, but they are subject to extreme levels of human rights abuses. And there are global international standards by which you treat accused criminals. And of course, the constitutions talk about habeas corpus rights, which are often violated. Talk about the impact that the violation of human rights creates in these prisons and what problems it generates for state capacity and for criminality in general. And I'm thinking specifically in the last year or so in El Salvador, which is a case that you know very well and have studied very well, along with Jose Miguel Cruz, have done some excellent work on gang and gang recidivism, et cetera. So talk about the impact that the Bukele repressive policies in the last year or so have had in terms of crime, criminality, and again, human rights abuses in that country, and then maybe generally.
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. I think the reality is mano dura kind of iron fist strategies have led to just an overswelling of prison populations, particularly in Central America, where you see some prisons at 300-400% of capacity. The Bartolinas in El Salvador, you literally need a hammock to sleep, and I've never seen, such a gross human rights violation, right? In terms of there's no place to stand, right? And so, the police officers or the corrections officers said, well, what do you want us to do? Right? We're operating a jail. In reality, we're operating a prison because people are there for years, right? They're only by law supposed to be there for 3 days. And so I think fundamentally you've seen gangs, particularly because of, the separation of gang members into different cells. Bukele said he was going to get rid of that. You've seen them kind of organize. You've seen different cliques from around the country kind of link up, and a lot of Jose Miguel's researchers has discussed this. And so I think you've seen a trend of the Bukele administration to have some real troubling issues with human rights. Now, El Salvador doesn't have the death penalty. So majority of these individuals are going to right, regardless of your opinion about the death penalty, are going to be released. And so there's this question of how do you deal with prevention? How do you also deal with reinsertion? And frankly, I think you've seen this across the region of, the violation of human rights, particularly the Bukele administration during the COVID pandemics, and this kind of, let's have semi-nude gang members, let's take photos of thousands of them violating protocols and the COVID restrictions. And fundamentally, it hasn't solved the underlying issues. So I think, this is not just, I think this is a major problem in Latin America of how do you deal with the rule of law in some of these institutions. I mean, Pablo Escobar built his own prison, right? And my favorite line is he told one of his enforcers, "Don't get worried, boys, till I put my shoes on." And then he escaped, right? And so you see prisons that are fundamentally centers of criminal activity. Now, just one final comment that I would make is the US has challenges too, right? We jail 2.3 million people. We jail more than any country on the face of the earth, total and per 100,000. And we spend $80 billion a year on corrections, right? 6 of every 10 of our people, folks, who go to prison return. So understanding these issues is a real challenge. And I think fundamentally the governments in Central America, Mexico, Brazil, you've seen these challenges of massive, and Ecuador recently, massive, not only human rights abuses, but massive riots, right? And significant levels of violence while, not necessarily addressing the kind of underlying issues, given the number of escapes and given the number of challenges. So I think fundamentally, from my point of view, maybe I have a one-track mind, but prisons are something that have really been understudied in looking at this entire issue. And I think play a kind of the lifeblood of this challenge, of organized crime.
Yes, indeed. So we have about 10 minutes. And I want to get to some of the questions in the Q&A from the audience. And so here's a question. It's directed. The context of it is South America, and it basically says, given the increasing divisive conditions. And I assume that this individual is talking about the politicization of these countries and the polarization of these societies. And he specifically says divisions in Chile, Bolivia, Peru, Colombia, and Brazil, and the complex and dynamic realities. Should we rethink democracy and security? Should we rethink the way we view these two concepts in the context of Latin America and the Caribbean? It's a very broad, tough question, but I'll throw it out to anyone who wants to take it. If not, I'll go to the next question.
Let me just say something to that question. I don't think we have sufficient understanding in the hemisphere about the link between security and democracy. I'm talking about understanding what is happening in great detail in Colombia as a result of the success of the government in achieving at least one peace treaty with the FARC, demobilization, better security. What's the impact of what's happened at the local level, at the community level? Do we have an understanding of this? So I think we need more research on again the linkage between democracy and security. Perhaps we're at such a level of analysis that we are not making the communication with the the person then asked that question, because democracy is supposed to include a better life, a better future, better economy, ultimately better security. So if we can't promise security to people, why promise democracy? The dilemma that I see emerging in so many countries right now and leading to authoritarian solutions.
Well, I mean, in Colombia, we certainly have, Duque has languaged in the 20% or so approval rating since very early on in his administration. Santos, despite the peace accords, ended not very popular. So power clearly exhausts, and there are forces going on in that country, which is not a country that I study very closely, but definitely given the possibility that someone like Gustavo Petro could win the presidency, there's clearly significant discontent. And actually, the results of the latest LAPOP survey of the Americas Barometer 2021 indicate that Colombia was among the lowest in terms of trust in elections, satisfaction with democracy, and many, many indicators. So whatever success Colombia had or can be imputed through the Plan Colombia and what President Uribe did during his presidency, et cetera, and Santos's peace accord, there's clearly forces going on there that that have generated significant discontent. Does anybody else, Tatiana or Jonathan, want
to ask something about Colombia, and it's partially related to this dilemma between security and democratization, democracy, because and the dilemma comes from the fact that if we impose too strict restrictions, and this would go in the way of having a healthy democratic process, freedom of expression, and all this. So I was thinking about Colombia and the peace accords and the violence that still persists. So on the one hand, you have this situation with that there should be stability and security. On the other hand is the big question of, can we have democratic future without having justice, transitional justice that was supposed to be implemented through the peace accords. So bringing the country together and somehow trying to address the question of the conflict, internal conflict. So this is a very difficult situation, and frankly, I don't know, to the best of my knowledge that I have learned on the case, it will be a very hard thing to do, given that support for the peace accords and the transitional justice instruments is kind of weakening, it seems to me. At the same time, violence is continuing.
Well, and the irony, and my friend Jennifer Holmes, who co-authored the Colombia piece in the book, would argue that, the irony is that, in fact, it could be argued that the fact that a candidate like Gustavo Petro is competitive and poised to perhaps win the presidency is in fact a sign that democracy is working in Colombia, that the left, and some might say the far left, is in fact able to win, and that now we don't know if he wins what's going to happen afterwards and how the established interests are going to react. But my sense is that he will be able to take power, and then it'll be up to him to govern. But that in and of itself is a good sign for democracy. We're fast approaching the end here. I want to give and it should be like 20 seconds or so, 30 seconds to each of you to kind of wrap up with some comments about the topic of the conversation. Final thoughts?
I was just going to say, I think there's pressure, and I think you see swings to the populist leaders, whether it's AMLO, it's someone like Bolsonaro. You see swings to left and right of people upset, people who are desperate for change. And I think going back to, maybe the more I study this, the more I become an institutionalist, going back to the fundamentals and basics of solving institutional problems. And that it requires not only, I think, a long-term challenge, I think, to an issue that many people want solved overnight, as though there was a magic solution. But I think fundamentally it's an issue of the rule of law and institutions.
Just a short comment. I was struck by the depth of the knowledge of the keynote speaker. I think we in academia need to make a link between the policymakers and the academic side. I think both sides can learn quite a bit. And this could be a model also for the civil-military relations in Latin America. That's all.
Well, we are, Tatiana, just a couple
I
of.
just wanted to say that institutional reform, I think, is key, because institutions are the best way to deal with the false promise of populism that is threatening all these young democracies and unstable democracies.
Well, we are at the end of our session. Thank you very much, Gabriel, Tatiana, Jonathan, for a fantastic conversation. Thank you to all of the audience. And I now return it to Brian, Randy. Who do I return it to?
Turn it back to Randy. So
See both of you. So Brian.
Well, Orlando, you can't get one without the other. You know that. So Brian and I are kind of a pea in a pod. Appreciate it, Orlando, your moderation. Dr. Costadinova, our colleagues over here at FIU, appreciate you and everything you do for our students. And Gabe, Jonathan, always a pleasure. Jonathan, that what stays in El Salvador happens in El Salvador, stays there, right? That refers to you as well. So thanks again for your always valuable contribution. But